October 16, 1946. Before dawn, the ropes in the Nuremberg prison gymnasium went taut. 10 leaders of the Third Reich hung in the darkness. The trapdoors had finished their work. Where did the physical remains of the regime vanish? Into classified military archives. Inside the gym, the air smelled of damp stone and stale sweat. Allied guards stood watch. The executions ended, but a second operation began. The victors imposed an absolute informational blockade. No civil death certificates were issued. No public records noted the weight or condition of the corpses. The families of the condemned requested the remains. The Allies refused. No relative was permitted to touch the caskets or verify the identities inside. Nuremberg transformed crimes into history, but it turned bodies into ghosts. Sealed military reports replaced public ritual. Secret night routes and a classified chain of command erased every physical trace. There were no announced burial sites. There were no final ceremonies. The Allies left no graves for a future cult to find. Before those 10 men climbed the gallows, the Allied leaders spent a year bartering over the right to end them. Europe was a graveyard of scorched cities and liberated death camps. The victors faced a single, jagged question: how to kill the architects of the abyss. Winston Churchill wanted them dead by sunset. No lawyers, no speeches. The British plan was a surgical strike of state violence. Any Allied military officer could identify a high-ranking Nazi, verify the name, and pull the trigger. Execution within 6 hours. London remembered the 1924 Munich Putsch trial. Back then, a younger Hitler had turned a courtroom into a recruitment center. Churchill refused to hand the Reich a final microphone. He feared a public trial would transform war criminals into martyrs of a lost cause. Joseph Stalin disagreed. Surprisingly, the Soviet dictator demanded a grand judicial spectacle. He wanted a public ceremony of guilt. For Moscow, a trial was not about justice, it was about a narrative. Every document and every televised testimony had to cement the Soviet Union as the sole savior of civilization. Stalin understood the power of the theater. The gavel was just another hammer. Harry Truman broke the deadlock. The American president rejected both the summary firing squad and the Soviet propaganda stage. He looked past the corpses to the future of international law. Truman pushed for a precedent that had never existed. He wanted to put individuals on trial for crimes against humanity, stripping away the shield of following orders. The gavel struck wood. On August 8, 1945, the Allies signed the London Charter, creating the legal machinery for the world's first international military tribunal. One court, 4 nations, 1945. Truman chose a legal precedent over a quick bullet. While politicians in Washington and Moscow carved up the post-war world, Sergeant John C. Woods was turning a prison gymnasium into an industrial killing floor. The gym at Nuremberg underwent a total structural overhaul. Engineers installed reinforced steel beams across the ceiling. Their sole purpose was to absorb the violent kinetic shock of a human body snapping a rope. The military demanded absolute isolation. Acoustic padding muffled the interior. Curtains blocked every window. They established internal routes to ensure the condemned never saw the men who would kill them. The machinery was primitive by design. Why? Manual levers provided total physical control that electrical systems lacked. Sergeant John C. Woods and his assistant Joseph Malta inspected the wood. 3 gallows stood in the center of the hall. Each structure rose exactly 2.5 meters high. The army installed indirect lighting. No press was allowed. Only military cameras waited in the shadows to document the mechanics of the end. At 1:11 in the morning on October 16th, the first lever moved. Woods had prepared exactly 3 scaffolds. The axes in the prison yard were not the only tools of deconstruction. On August 8, 1945, the London Charter arrived in the city. It was the blueprint for a new world. This document established the International Military Tribunal. It was the first time in history that a state's domestic policy became a global crime. The architects of the trial built the prosecution on 3 pillars: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity. This legal trinity criminalized the very soul of the Third Reich. 24 leaders stood in the dock. Men who once commanded millions now answered to a panel of judges. The choice of location was a calculated execution of a legacy. Nuremberg. The city was the symbolic lungs of the Nazi Party. It was here they held their massive rallies. It was here they proclaimed the racial laws that stripped millions of their right to exist. The Allies chose this ground to kill the party where it was born. The courtroom turned into a geopolitical theater. Each power fought for the narrative. American prosecutors played footage of the camps. Soviet officials demanded focus on the Red Army's sacrifice. France struggled to look like a great power again. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom worked behind the scenes to ensure the trial never mentioned colonial atrocities. The judicial machine, set in motion by the London Charter, ground to a halt at 1:11 in the morning on October 16th. The procession to the gallows began. Joachim von Ribbentrop walked first. The former foreign minister stepped onto the wooden platform. He spoke of German unity and peace between East and West. Then the heavy trapdoor snapped open. Wilhelm Keitel followed. The chief of the High Command did not scream. He murmured a prayer for the German people. Beside him, Ernst Kaltenbrunner maintained his wall of denial. Even with the evidence of the Reich Security Main Office spread before the court, he claimed total ignorance. He died as he lived, a lie. Alfred Rosenberg, the architect of racial hate, chose a different path. He climbed the steps in absolute silence. No final words, no prayer, just the sound of boots on wood. Hans Frank sought a different escape. The butcher of occupied Poland, responsible for millions of deaths, turned to the crucifix. He converted to Catholicism in his cell. He attempted to wash away the blood of a nation with holy water and a public display of remorse. Wilhelm Frick stayed loyal to the ghost of the Reich. He implemented the Nuremberg laws as interior minister. On the scaffold, he shouted a final salute to an eternal Germany. The most disturbing moment belonged to Julius Streicher. The editor of Der Stürmer did not go quietly. He screamed, "Heil Hitler," while ascending the steps. On the edge of the drop, he shrieked a reference to the Jewish holiday of Purim, a final grotesque act of defiance. The metal levers clashed. The trapdoor gave way. Fritz Sockel proclaimed his innocence until the rope tightened. He oversaw the slave labor program that ground millions into the earth. To the end, he claimed he was merely a subordinate. Alfred Jodl, the chief of operations, stood rigid. His final greeting to Germany was barely a whisper. Arthur Seyss-Inquart expressed the wish that his death would be the last of the war. He was the 11th. Alfred Jodl continued to mutter a final greeting to Germany. While the last curses echoed in the gymnasium, a diplomatic landmine was already ticking within the tribunal's protocols. The Cold War began in the courtroom. Robert Jackson shuffled his private memorandums. The American chief prosecutor was caught between two fires. President Truman demanded a legal masterpiece. The State Department demanded speed. Washington feared a long trial would let the architects of the Reich slip through technical loopholes. Jackson wrote a warning in his diary. A failed trial would feed future deniers. The Soviet delegation had a different plan. They brought the experience of the Moscow trials to Germany. For them, the court was a stage for propaganda. The Katyn massacre became the breaking point. Soviet prosecutors submitted manipulated documents to blame the Wehrmacht for the execution of 22,000 Polish officers. Jackson watched the Soviet maneuvers. The rustle of diplomatic telegrams filled the prosecutors' tables. Every piece of evidence became a trench. Every witness became a strategic asset. The Allies argued over the very definition of crimes against humanity. These whispers in Nuremberg were the first rehearsals for the Iron Curtain. The legal architecture survived the political friction. In 1946, the model moved to the Tokyo Tribunal. Decades later, the spirit of Nuremberg resurfaced in the ruins of Yugoslavia in 1993 and the hills of Rwanda in 1994. The experiment transformed into a permanent system. In 2002, the world established the International Criminal Court. Thought. 28 minutes of slow suffocation. Why did a precise military machine allow half an hour of agony? The United States categorically refused help from British engineers. The American gallows in the Nuremberg gym was a technical failure. Master Sergeant John C. Woods chose the short drop method. He ignored the long drop manuals. He ignored physics. The rope length was calculated incorrectly. The trapdoor was too narrow. The drop began. The snap of the neck never came. Bodies hit the wooden frame of the structure with a dull thud. Necks remained intact. The prisoners didn't die from a broken spine. They died from the tightening of a noose. The sensory reality was clinical and grim. Inside the wooden box, bodies thrashed against the boards. The sound of wood splintering under the weight of convulsing men filled the room. Dr. Charles Larson stood by with a stopwatch. He waited. He checked for reflexes. Larson documented every sign of life. Residual neurological activity, heartbeats that refused to stop. The medical team examined each body for at least 5 minutes to rule out apparent death. They needed certainty. They got a massacre. Julius Stryker provided the most extreme case. He kicked, he groaned. His face turned purple, then black, disfigured by the pressure. It took him over 20 minutes to stop moving. British experts had offered their assistance. They knew how to calibrate the drop based on weight and height. The Americans said no. Washington wanted total control over the final act. Geopolitical pride turned the execution into a series of botched lynchings. The American soldiers improvised. They used the same short drop technique common in U.S. civilian hangings of that era. It was never meant for the high-stakes theater of war crimes. 1 hour and 34 minutes. That is how long it took to kill 10 men. The 94 minutes of chaos in the gymnasium confirmed a deep Allied fear. Dead ideologists are often more dangerous than living ones. The Big Three remembered the aftermath of the Great War. Then, the graves of fallen soldiers became ideological fuel. They turned into shrines. The Allies refused to repeat history. They didn't just want to execute men. They wanted to erase a cult. Any physical remains could become a site of pilgrimage for neo-Nazis. A headstone is a monument. A name on a grave is a rally point. The doctrine was simple. No bodies, no altars, no memory. But the system failed before the first rope tightened. On October 15, 1946, a single glass object shattered the Allied security protocol. One cyanide capsule destroyed the illusion of total control. Hermann Göring sat in his cell. He was the most prominent face of the Reich. The guards watched him constantly. Yet he held a secret. He chose his own exit. He bit down on the glass. The second man of the Third Reich died on his own terms. Göring committed suicide. To prevent Göring's supporters from claiming even a single icon, a protocol of total erasure activated the moment death was confirmed. The Allied objective was achieved. Physical elimination of the condemned was now a documented fact. They denied every man a soldier's death. No firing squads, only the gallows. The rope was a calculated insult, traditionally reserved for common criminals. 10 bodies lay lifeless by dawn. The Allies signaled a clear message to the world. These were not defeated warriors. They were convicted murderers. The military morgue became a clinical laboratory. No civilian witnesses were allowed. None. Yet military cameras captured everything. Blinding flashes illuminated the stripped, graying faces. Photography teams worked in silence. They captured every angle. Special focus remained on the necks and the deep bruising from the rope. The images revealed a grim reality. Flushed faces, bleeding from the nose and mouth. These were visual receipts of technical failures during the strangulation process. A secret medical protocol governed every movement. Doctors recorded the exact second of death. They logged cervical fractures and estimated the duration of asphyxiation. The bureaucracy of the hangman was meticulous. It was cold. It was final. Standard procedures ceased to exist. Authorities refused to issue civilian death certificates to the families. The process of physical erasure followed clinical documentation. Military personnel stripped the bodies of every remaining shred of identity. Prison uniforms, shoes, and rings were removed. Spectacles and dentures followed. Guards cataloged every item with cold precision. This was not a standard procedure. It was a calculated dismantling. They aimed to prevent the creation of any ideological relic. The strategy changed from execution to invisibility. Officials emptied the pockets of the dead. Glasses were seized. Even dental work was documented and then obscured. Why go to such lengths? The goal was to transform high-ranking Nazi leaders into a nameless cargo. Wooden coffins arrived. They bore no inscriptions. No markings identified the men inside. The logistics of the Allied command required a cover story for the transport. Every crate received a fictitious name. The identities belonged to American soldiers who had supposedly died of natural causes. This prevented any suspicion during the long road ahead. The weight of the crates matched the official manifests of the U.S. Army. By the time the loading finished, the leaders of the Third Reich existed only as administrative ghosts. They left behind zero personal belongings. By 4 in the morning on October 17th, the final phase began. 11 wooden coffins stood ready. One contained the remains of Hermann Göring. The others held the architects of the Third Reich. Colonel William Schadel took command of the loading. He was a former CBS reporter turned military propaganda specialist. In 1946, the occupation command moved him to Germany for a specific reason. Schadel applied the methods of the OSS. He used strict compartmentalization. The goal was simple: zero traceability. Army trucks backed into the shadows. Soldiers hoisted the boxes into the cargo beds. To any outside observer, this was a routine transport. The official manifest listed a single deceased American soldier. The cause of death was recorded as a generic illness. The engines turned over with a low, rhythmic thrum. At 4 o'clock sharp, the convoy moved. Armored jeeps led the way through the ruins of Nuremberg. Schadel ordered the headlights dimmed to a minimum. The trucks avoided the main highways. They turned onto narrow, unpaved back roads. The route bypassed every major town. No witnesses. No accidental encounters. Even the drivers remained in the dark. Under OSS protocols, the men behind the wheel had no idea what lay in the crates behind them. The convoy slipped into the countryside and vanished into the pre-dawn mist. 11 coffins moved toward an unmarked destination under the cover of a falsified military legend. In October 1946, a German worker named recorded a private note about sealed American coffins. His words exposed the cracks in a massive operation of silence. Otto L. watched the trucks arrive at the Munich Ostfriedhof crematorium. Armed guards stood at every entrance. The Americans refused to answer questions. Their faces remained stone. Was the secrecy absolute? Not for those operating the furnaces. Otto L. noted the unusual urgency of the Americans. He wrote that he felt they were burning more than just anonymous soldiers. The smell of scorched linen hung in the air as the sealed bags went into the heat. The furnaces ran for several hours without a break. To prevent the mixing of ashes, the staff incinerated each body individually. This was industrial precision applied to a political erasure. Workers placed the remains into generic urns. No names, no inscriptions. These urns moved immediately to a secure military facility under heavy escort. Inside the complex, a small group of officers oversaw the final packaging. They transferred the gray dust into simple linen bags and pressed official seals into the fabric. In the early hours of October 18th, the military moved these bags to a secure army installation. How to legalize the secret destruction of the Reich's top leaders? The answer lay in forged paperwork for dead American soldiers. These 11 coffins reached Munich's Ostfriedhof Cemetery after a 4-hour journey under heavy guard. The OSS protocols demanded total deception. American officers handed over falsified manifests to the German staff. The documents listed the deceased as U.S. Army personnel who had succumbed to infectious diseases. The clerk checked the seals. He verified the stamps. No one opened the lids. The facility itself carried a grim historical irony. Built in 1929, the Ostfriedhof crematorium had served the Nazi regime as a tool of terror. For years, its fires consumed the bodies of political dissidents and victims of racial persecution. The SS used these same halls to dispose of those executed in nearby concentration camps. Now, the occupation authorities turned the infrastructure of the Reich against its creators. The process was mechanical. U.S. military police cleared the building. Civilian technicians took their positions under direct supervision. The heavy iron doors swung open. Inside, two primary Siemens furnaces waited. These machines, engineered in the late 20s, represented the peak of industrial efficiency. The technicians ignited the burners. A dull roar filled the empty hall as the internal sensors climbed. To prevent any future DNA identification, the heat had to be absolute. The bone tissue needed to vanish. By the time the first coffin slid onto the rails, the Siemens furnaces reached temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees. Constitutional psychopathic inferiority without psychosis. The diagnosis sat in the 1930 medical files of the United States Navy. It described a man with erratic behavior and an inability to follow rules. This clinical label usually closed every door to federal service, but the machine of the Second World War had no memory. While the Ostfriedhof furnaces erased the physical remains of the Reich, a document from 15 years earlier gathered dust in an archive. It belonged to the man who provided those furnaces with their work, John Clarence Woods. Born in Wichita, Kansas in 1911, his first military stint lasted only 1 year. The Navy handed him a dishonorable discharge. He was socially unstable, unfit for command, unfit for the ranks. Years later, the system failed to check its own blacklists. Woods re-enlisted in the Army, hiding his past. By 1944, he was serving in France with the 37th Engineer Combat Battalion. The Army needed someone to handle the dirty work of the European campaign. They needed a hangman for American soldiers convicted of capital crimes. A diagnosis from 1930 did not stop him from becoming the Army's lead executioner in 1944. Woods stepped forward. He claimed he had experience in Texas and Oklahoma. He offered no proof, no records, no references. The officers looked at the paperwork. They saw a volunteer in a war that demanded efficiency over character. They ignored the gaps in his history. The officer pressed a rubber stamp onto the transfer forms. Ink hit the paper. Without a single background check, John Woods became the official executioner. The Nuremberg trial cost millions of dollars. It employed thousands of lawyers and translators. Yet for the final act against the architects of the Holocaust, the system chose a man without even a basic specialized education. This was the ultimate institutional blindness. The tribunal required a hangman. John Clarence Woods stood ready. He had already executed minor war criminals in smaller trials across Germany. To the high command, he looked like a seasoned professional. He was the natural candidate. The bureaucracy prioritized speed over audit. No one requested his military record. No one checked his medical files. The American justice machine delegated the historical finale of the Third Reich to a sergeant with a history of desertion. Nuremberg was a masterpiece of international law. It sought to prove that civilization could overcome barbarism through logic. But at the end of the gavel, the system took a shortcut. It ignored its own protocols to fill a vacancy. The military command signed the papers. They handed the mandate for the world's most significant execution to a man diagnosed with psychopathic inferiority. The appointment was finalized. Out of 34 executions, at least 11 ended in technical failure. This was the recorded track record of the 3rd United States Army's official hangman. By the time he arrived in Nuremberg, Woods' statistics already contained these critical systemic glitches. The rope creaked under the weight of condemned men. In Chartres, France, Lieutenant Jack Healy watched the trapdoors fail. He noted in his diary that Woods treated the gallows like a theatrical stage. During one execution, a prisoner lost control of his bladder. Woods laughed. Soldiers avoided him. They reported a persistent body odor and a mocking attitude toward the dying. He was unkempt, disorganized. But the military machine ignored the red flags. How long does it take for a heart to stop? One African-American soldier hung for 25 minutes. He gasped for air while the system watched. It wasn't a clean break of the neck. It was slow, manual strangulation. The trapdoors were too narrow. The drops were calculated incorrectly. Woods never admitted a technical error. He told his superiors the prisoners died slowly because they moved too much during the fall. In Nuremberg, the victors brought 3 different philosophies of death to the table. The Soviets preferred a single pistol shot to the back of the head. Quick, surgical, final. The French stood by the guillotine, a relic of revolutionary precision. The British relied on the long drop method, a system of mathematical execution perfected since the 19th century. But the Americans chose improvisation over science. Why did this technical catastrophe occur? Master Sergeant John C. Woods chose to ignore every law of physics and Army regulation. The United States military had a blueprint for this. Field Manual 8285. It contained exact formulas. It dictated rope length based on the prisoner's weight to ensure a clean cervical fracture. Woods tossed the manual aside. He didn't measure the condemned. He didn't calculate the tension. The gallows became a site of mechanical failure. The trapdoors were too narrow and poorly aligned. When the bolt pulled, the bodies didn't just fall, they swung wildly. The prisoner drops. The rope snaps taut. The skull slams against the wooden edge of the frame. Instead of an instant break of the atlas vertebra, there was only the sound of bone hitting timber. The ropes were too short to generate the necessary kinetic force. Without the proper counterweights, death became a lottery. Some died in seconds. Others twisted for 20 minutes, slowly strangling in the dark beneath the platform. This amateurism stood in stark contrast to the British long drop, a method meticulously engineered for efficiency as far back as the 1800s. "I've never hanged an innocent man," John C. Woods told a circle of reporters. He leaned in. "Hanging those Nazis was the best thing I ever did." Flashbulbs popped. The hangman was smiling. This public boasting turned the technical failures of the gallows into a geopolitical nightmare for Washington. The United States had spent months framing Nuremberg as a triumph of impartial law. Woods was framing it as a personal vendetta. "If they call me again, I'll be ready," he declared to the press. The State Department watched in silence as their carefully built narrative of justice dissolved into a story of emotional revenge. The executioner's pride was a leak in the system. Internal military reports painted a darker picture than the newspaper headlines. Confidential files described Woods as unhygienic and mentally unstable. Officers noted the persistent smell of alcohol on his breath during duty. They recorded his inappropriate jokes made while preparing the nooses. The Pentagon faced a choice: court-martial a national hero or hide the problem. They chose the latter. The system protected itself by rewarding the man it secretly despised. The Army awarded Woods the Meritorious Service Medal for his work at Nuremberg. There was no public ceremony. Shortly after the medal was pinned, the command signed his papers. The military transferred Woods quietly to the Pacific Theater. The Allied command moved past the technical theater of the gallows. While Woods shared his stories with the press, Washington planners finalized a strategy for global erasure. The goal was simple: total physical oblivion. The staff initially proposed a hidden corner of a U.S. military cemetery. They considered cremation on French soil under Allied jurisdiction. They rejected it. Even the vastness of the Atlantic Ocean seemed too risky for a permanent burial at sea. Why such paranoia? The victors feared the power of a grave. A single stone could become a shrine. A drop of blood could spark a movement. They needed a solution where recovery was mathematically impossible. The Tokyo trials provided a grim comparison. Japanese war criminals left behind graves that eventually turned into political tools and pilgrimage sites for the far right. Nuremberg could not repeat this mistake. The system demanded a clean break from history. Planners scrutinized the geography of Bavaria. They needed a force of nature to act as a bureaucratic shredder. The River Isar offered the final answer. Its current would transform the leaders of the Third Reich into anonymous sediment within seconds. The decision-makers chose the water for its speed and depth. This choice turned the final act of the war into the most anomalous procedure in modern judicial history. They traded the ritual of burial for the efficiency of the Isar. The decision to erase history led the secret convoy to the fast-moving waters of the River Isar. It was the early hours of October 18, 1946. Two trucks stopped between Munich and Landshut. Rain or mist often masked such movements in the Bavarian autumn. The soldiers carried sealed linen bags to the bank. Inside were the ashes of the Third Reich's elite. The current here reached speeds of nearly 2.5 meters per second. This was a calculated choice. At this velocity, any solid matter disperses completely within 60 seconds. The officers cut the linen. They tilted the bags over the dark surface. Gray dust hit the water and vanished instantly. There were no prayers, no cameras, no final salutes. The grand theater of the Nuremberg trials ended in a silent disposal of waste. The state machine then began its long silence. For over 30 years, no official document confirmed the location of the remains. Families received brief, cold notifications. The letter stated only that the execution followed the International Military Tribunal's decree. The military skipped every detail regarding cremation or the scattering of ashes. There were no geographic markers and no plaques left on the riverbank. The current took everything. The ashes disappeared forever. While the current of the Isar carried the remains away, the administrative machine began to fabricate a new history. The cremation at Ostfriedhof was not a funeral. It was a logistical operation of erasure. The state used a protocol of total compartmentalization. This was the same architecture of secrecy used during the Manhattan Project. Information was a weapon. Access was restricted. Did the participants understand the scale? They did not. Dozens of people managed the logistics, but not one of them saw the full picture. Drivers moved sealed loads without knowing the contents. Crematorium staff processed bodies without names. Soldiers scattered ash without knowing its origin. Every step was a dead end. The bureaucracy then turned to the archives. A clerk sat at a desk. He dipped a pen in ink. He wrote down fictitious serial numbers of American soldiers. He assigned them fabricated medical diagnoses. A military chaplain's signature appeared on the forms. It was a forgery. The paper crinkled as it was filed away in fresh folders. These documents created a wall of white noise. If an investigator looked at the books, they saw only standard military losses: heart failure, shrapnel wounds, routine casualties. The truth remained hidden for 30 years. 4 years after forging the final records of Nuremberg, the system permanently closed the case on John C. Woods. The year was 1950. The location was Kwajalein, a remote military outpost in the Marshall Islands. Woods served there with the 59th General Service Regiment. He was working as a military electrician. On July 21, 1950, he was repairing lighting equipment. A surge hit. Woods died instantly from electrocution. Was it a mechanical failure or a planned disappearance? The Department of War labeled it a non-combat death due to electrical malfunction. The official file contains no photographs. It holds no witness statements. Rumors filled the vacuum. Some spoke of a hidden suicide. Others whispered about a secret manuscript Woods was writing, a tell-all book about the Nuremberg hangings that could compromise the United States. When civilian researchers tried to access the 59th Group's archives in the 1980s, the most critical documents had vanished. The Army treated the death as a routine technical loss. No honors were rendered. No special mentions were requested by the military or his widow for his headstone. In Wichita, the man who dropped the trapdoor on the Third Reich was buried in a nameless, unremarkable plot. He ended as he began, an anonymous instrument of a state machine that no longer needed him. The military authorities authorized the burial in a plain grave without a single ceremony. The most guarded prisoner in Europe escaped the noose because of a glass vial. Hermann Goering used a cyanide capsule to cheat the gallows. A 19-year-old American guard made it possible. How did a death row inmate obtain poison under constant surveillance? For decades, the official story remained a vague suggestion. Investigators claimed Goering hid the capsule in a body cavity since his capture. The truth waited until 2005. Herbert Lee Stivers broke his silence. In 1946, he was a young soldier in Nuremberg. An attractive German woman approached him during his shift. She handed him a medical pen. She claimed the Reichsmarshal was ill and needed medicine. Stivers was 19. He was impressionable. The handoff was mechanical. The woman passed the pen. Stivers felt the cold metal. He heard the dry click of the casing as he checked the device. He suspected nothing. Inside the pen lay a tiny glass container filled with liquid death. This was a breach in the macro system of Allied security. Göring was the highest-ranking Nazi in captivity. His suicide was a tactical strike against the legitimacy of the entire tribunal. It proved that even the most rigorous protocols had human vulnerabilities. External networks of sympathizers were watching. They waited for a lapse in judgment. The identity of the woman remains a mystery. Her connections to underground Nazi cells were never traced. After the suicide, investigators recovered the spent vial from Göring's cell. Military intelligence seized the glass shards and the container as forensic evidence. They photographed every piece. Then, the object vanished. There is no public record of the vial in any museum or institutional collection. The current location of Göring's cyanide capsule is unknown. To minimize security breaches, Allied command launched a rigid asset seizure protocol. The goal was simple: total sterilization. Decades later, these confiscated items still sit in classified military intelligence archives, far from public view. Military police stripped the condemned of everything. An officer checked the cell. He emptied the pockets. He inspected the seams. Watches, rings, and cufflinks hit the table first. Then came the glasses, pens, and personal photos. Even the uniforms with military insignia were catalogued like evidence in a mass murder case. The smell of burning wool filled the industrial furnaces. Guards tossed Nazi tunics into the fires. They watched the fabric curl and blacken until only ash remained. No museum samples, no intact souvenirs. The victors wanted zero physical traces of the regime's leadership. How did they handle the sheer volume of plunder? Allied bureaucracy divided every object into 3 operational categories. The first pile held judicial evidence. The second contained items for immediate destruction due to ideological weight. The third included historical documents for intelligence analysis. Medals presented a specific problem. The Iron Cross and the Knight's Cross were more than military awards. They were icons of the Eastern Front. Many were forged from precious metals, forcing a choice between their material value and their political poison. The system recognized exactly 3 operational categories. The bureaucratic machine ignored the artistic value of the Reich's relics. It looked for the weight of the metal. Allied commanders saw gold and silver. They also saw political poison. The state began a cold, industrial separation of value from ideology. The process was rhythmic and mechanical. Imagine a workshop table. A hammer strikes. The silver SS runes snap off a black tunic. They fall into a bucket with a sharp metallic ring. 1 bucket for the treasury, 1 for the incinerator. The victors melted the precious metals into anonymous ingots. The symbols, the Totenkopf skulls, the swastikas, the imperial eagles, were crushed into dust. Pure pragmatism met total erasure. This was not a local German phenomenon. It was a global protocol of sterilization. In 1945, after the execution of Benito Mussolini, the new Italian government seized everything. Some items vanished into state archives. Most were simply destroyed. In Japan, the script remained the same. Following the trial of Hideki Tojo, officials gathered the imperial uniforms. They feared these threads would become nationalist fetishes for a new generation. Every stitch of the emperor's authority was burned. The military authorities dismantled the uniforms of the Japanese High Command. The systematic scrubbing of the SS runes within prison walls was only a microscopic part of a global territory purge. Why did the Allies methodically destroy libraries and monuments? To sterilize the geopolitical space against any possibility of revenge. Memory became a target of high-level strategy. In Germany, from 1945 to 1949, the cleansing was industrial. Tens of thousands of books disappeared from public shelves. NSDAP archives went into the furnace. Hitler's statues fell. Commemorative plaques inside administrative buildings were smashed to dust. The scale was total. 35,000 book titles were officially banned and confiscated by the Allied Control Council. This erasure became a standard geopolitical template. It repeated in Cambodia after the fall of Pol Pot. Portraits, uniforms, and Khmer Rouge literature were fed to the flames. Decades later, the process mirrored itself in Iraq. After the capture of Saddam Hussein, the Ba'ath Party's symbolic spine was snapped. Statues toppled. Thousands of official artifacts vanished. These methods of denazification provided the exact blueprint for the de-Baathification of Iraq half a century later. The victors did not just occupy land. They neutralized the symbolic resource. They dismantled the physical presence of a fallen empire. Allied authorities faced a crisis of matter. Executions stripped the Third Reich of its leaders, but their shadow remained in the physical world. Thousands of uniforms, medals, and personal belongings sat in storage. To the guards, these were items. To the planners, they were political vectors. The military understood the risk. In previous decades, they watched how a simple scrap of cloth from a historical figure could become a holy relic. Objects possess gravity. They can pull a fractured movement back together. Look at the empty tunics. They were stripped of all insignia. Swastikas and oak leaves were ripped from the wool. Without the symbols, the fabric meant nothing. With them, it was a catalyst for a religious cult. The Allies treated these possessions like a virus. A gold party badge or a knight's cross was not a souvenir. It was a potential battery for the survival of Nazi ideology. A rigorous protocol of confiscation transformed every artifact into a security threat. The state's monopoly on seizing artifacts triggered a massive black market in post-war Europe. Private collectors bypassed official bans. They hunted for physical fragments of the collapsed regime. Scholars call it political necrofetishism. It is the urge to own a piece of absolute evil. Keitel's pocket watch appeared in private auctions. Yodel's wedding ring surfaced decades later, passed through trembling hands in secret rooms. The demand grew faster than the supply of genuine relics. In the shadows, the detail defined the price. Look at the monogram on Ribbentrop's cufflinks. Gold. Precise. A personal mark of a man sent to the gallows. Forensic analysts now scan these objects for DNA or period-accurate alloys. Some are real, most are shadows. The scarcity of verified originals created a void. Forgers filled it immediately. They aged fabric with chemicals and engraved names onto standard military gear. Today, the market for fake Nazi memorabilia thrives because the authentic remains are out of reach. France and Austria maintain some of the strictest bans on Third Reich imagery in the world. Germany follows the same path. Public display is a crime. Commercial sale is a felony. In these jurisdictions, a swastika or an SS rune is not an antique. It is a biological hazard of history. Only strict educational or artistic contexts provide a narrow legal corridor for their existence. The rare authentic pieces that avoided private auctions ended up in a different kind of prison. They sit in the institutional quarantine of state museums and international archives. An anonymous box arrives at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Forensic experts step in. They verify the provenance. They match the serial numbers to Nuremberg trial evidence. The storage rooms remain under sterile white light. No public access, no cameras, no flashes. These artifacts are isolated as securely as their owners once were. Curators treat them as physical evidence of industrialized genocide. The metal and fabric have no value. Only the moral weight remains. In the museums of Washington and the archives of Nuremberg, the policy is absolute. Zero public demonstrations of artifacts occur without a forced educational context. The quarantine extended beyond physical artifacts. On October 16, 1946, the Allies classified the very fact of the burials. The morning of October 16th began in silence. International journalists crowded the press center. They expected details. They expected the symbolic climax of the century's most significant trial. Instead, They watched a military officer walk to the podium. He handed out thin sheets of paper. The rustle of paper filled the room. One paragraph, no more. The joint communiqué from the four powers was surgically brief. It stated the sentences were carried out in the early hours of October 16th. It mentioned the remains were disposed of according to military protocols. That was it. No press conference followed. No photographs appeared. No additional details emerged. The Allies had triggered a total information vacuum. This was a geopolitical calculation to prevent the creation of shrines. Did the law require this level of secrecy? No. Standard judicial practice across the West dictated formal notification and identifiable remains. Even the Tokyo trials of 1948 followed a different logic. In Japan, the execution of war criminals remained part of the public record. Families received notices. Burial sites were documented. In Nuremberg, the state chose to erase the physical trace of the dead entirely. The information vacuum surrounding the International Military Tribunal struck the families of the condemned first. In Nuremberg, the bureaucratic machine replaced grief with a standard form. The notification arrived as a dry, typewritten sheet. At the center sat a single, unified paragraph. Only a blank space remained for the name of the executed man. The text offered no comfort. It stated simply, "The sentence passed against the individual has been carried out. No further information will be provided on this matter." Relatives saw only cold ink on cheap paper. They received no personal effects, no watches, no letters, no rings. The state denied them the right to hold a funeral or even know the location of the remains. In Japan, families could visit graves. In Germany, the families faced a wall of silence. The Allies designed this void to be absolute. The denial of the bodies to the families marked the final chord of a modern damnatio memoriae in Bavaria. This ancient Roman practice aimed at the total erasure of a person from history. In 1946, the Allies revived it. The bureaucracy moved first. An official death certificate usually enters the public German civil registry. Not this time. Instead, a heavy metal stamp hit confidential military files. The ink was barely dry before the classification. Each record received a high-level security clearance. It was an isolation of the dead from the living. The Allies bypassed the common administrative machine. These names did not exist in civilian ledgers. No graves, no records, no memory. Neutral nations watched from the borders. In Switzerland and Sweden, the silence felt unnatural. 2 weeks passed. Then, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung broke the tension. Their Munich correspondent published a headline, "The Mystery of the Disappeared Bodies." The report was blunt. No Bavarian official possessed information on the burials. Local cemeteries remained empty of the high-ranking dead. The void started to breathe rumors. The occupation authorities reacted with bureaucratic force. They needed to suppress the rising controversy. An Allied military spokesman in Bavaria issued a categorical denial. He dismissed the reports as morbid conjecture and the spread of falsehoods. The representative of the four powers officially denied the existence of any secret operation. In October 1946, American military intelligence launched a massive deception operation in Munich. Colonel William S. Shadow led the mission. Its goal was simple: delete the physical and legal existence of the Third Reich's leadership. The level of secrecy was extreme. Shadow assigned the mission Category 5 status. In 1946, Category 5 was the bureaucratic equivalent of the Manhattan Project. The mechanism of forgery started at the Ostfriedhof crematorium. Clerks opened the logistics logs. They didn't leave blanks, they rewrote history. Fresh ink smeared across the pages. Shadow's team inserted fictional serial numbers over real data. They created a new reality: unidentified American soldiers. The cause of death was always the same: infectious diseases. This diagnostic lie prevented anyone from demanding an autopsy or an open casket. The forgery went deeper. The logs required spiritual witnesses. Shadow's men didn't call for priests. They picked up pens. They forged the signatures of military chaplains for cremations that never happened. These men of God existed only on paper, their names masking the smoke of the Nuremberg executions. Shadow's forgery served a global objective. They had to cement Nuremberg as a flawless triumph of justice. In 1995, the U.S. Department of Defense finally spoke. Their official statement claimed the secrecy was a tactical necessity. They had to prevent the creation of Nazi shrines. This was the official shield. But was the fear of neo-Nazis the only motive? The risks were real. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's tomb in Predapio became a site of pilgrimage. Fascists gathered there in the open. In Japan, the remains of executed war criminals ended up in the Yasukuni Shrine. Diplomatic tension flared across Asia. Protests erupted. The ghosts of the occupation returned through protocol notes and official visits. Nuremberg was different. It was the foundation of the post-war world. The Allies were not just hanging men, they were legitimizing the United Nations. They needed absolute moral clarity. Imagine the podium in 1995. A spokesperson reads a prepared text. Reporters take notes. The narrative is controlled. Behind the scenes, the motivation was deeper. It was about the monopoly on history. The process demanded a symbolic closure. No gaps, no errors. If the public saw the truth, the botched hangings, the unstable executioner, the frantic disposal of ash, the image of exemplary justice would shatter. The Allies required a clean finish, not a controversial epilogue. The New World Order rested on the fact that the monsters had simply vanished. The global narrative of a clean victory required a dirty finale. Ordinary men executed the final geopolitical order of the great powers. In 1981, Karl-Heinz Gruber broke his silence to Der Spiegel. He was a worker at the Ostfriedhof crematorium when the American trucks arrived. It was before dawn. The officers presented papers claiming the bodies were soldiers killed by typhus. Gruber knew it was a lie. The guards watched every move. They blocked any attempt to inspect the remains. One coffin stood out. It bore a different seal, heavy, formal, and authoritative. The furnaces burned for 12 hours straight. Standard protocol vanished. Usually, workers placed ashes in memorial urns. Not this time. The remains were swept into unmarked metal containers. The Americans seized them immediately. Did the workers know whose legacy they were incinerating? They followed orders. The final act moved to the riverbank. Hermann Lanzinger, a young Bavarian soldier, stood in the mud near Freising. The Americans drove him to a specific bend in the Isar. The current there is violent and fast. Lanzinger gripped a metal shovel. He felt the scrape of steel against the bottom of the containers. He and the other men worked in total darkness. They dumped the contents of several bags into the rushing water. The Isar flows into the Danube. The Danube crosses half of Europe. By choosing this spot, the Allies ensured the remains would be scattered across multiple borders, dissolved into the geography of a dozen nations. No one spoke. The officers ordered the men not to look directly at the waste. They stood in the cold, throwing handfuls of gray dust into the Black River. Lanzinger could feel the grit on his skin. It was obvious they were discarding human ashes. While the ashes dissolved in the waters of the Isar, the victors began crafting the official memory of the war. They needed a clean, surgical cut. No epilogue, no martyrs. The Nuremberg Tribunal existed to document everything. Thousands of tons of paper, millions of feet of film. Yet the same institution that demanded total transparency chose total erasure for its final act. It was a geopolitical paradox. The Allies defeated the Third Reich on the battlefield. Now they were dictating how history would absorb the remains. By the time the secret leaked, the world had moved on. The Berlin Wall already split Germany in two. Western and Soviet spies shifted their focus from old Nazis to new nuclear silos. The Cold War reconfigured every map and every priority. The mystery of the bodies simply faded into the background of a nuclear standoff. This was the ultimate pragmatism of international law. The victors established the standard for documenting atrocities so they would never be forgotten. Simultaneously, they implemented protocols of absolute secrecy to ensure certain traces were never found. The The strategy held for 30 years. The vacuum created on the banks of the river Isar did not stay empty. It was filled by the very forces the Nuremberg tribunal sought to erase. Physical liquidation failed to kill the cult. It only forced it to mutate. By the late 1960s, the disappearance of the bodies shifted the geography of memory from graves to shadows. Neo-Nazi movements lacked a central shrine. They lacked a physical site for pilgrimage. In response, they developed a system of abstract commemoration. The date was October 16th. On this night, small flickers of light appeared along the dark banks of the river Isar. Candles floated on the water. Bunches of flowers appeared near the Waldfriedhof cemetery without explanation. There were no names on these tributes, no inscriptions. To the uninitiated, it looked like a random vigil. To the initiated, it was a precise ritual. Intelligence agencies realized the threat had changed form. The BND, the CIA, and MI6 began tracking these silent gatherings. They analyzed the timing. They mapped the locations. Reports from the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution in the 1980s confirmed the shift. The strategy was simple. Instead of a physical tomb, they used a calendar. Instead of a headstone, they used a coded date. Security services moved from guarding sites to monitoring encrypted anniversaries. The official silence of West Germany acted as a catalyst. It did not erase the past. It fueled a new, dangerous mythology. Authorities in Bonn and the Allied High Command issued a single directive: military security. They scrubbed the records: no burial certificates, no death notices, no funeral registries. Academic attempts to trace the bodies in the late 1950s met a wall of bureaucracy. The state chose a vacuum. But history abhors a vacuum. Revisionist circles saw an opening. If there are no bodies, there were no executions. Rumors crossed the Atlantic. Stories of secret pacts and body doubles surfaced in Latin America. Conspiracy became the only available logic. Why the silence? The answer lay in the ledgers, not the graves. Internal reports from Allied prosecutors revealed a calculated move. They excluded massive corporate archives from the Nuremberg trials. These documents detailed collaborations between German industry and Western giants. The strategy was simple. Protecting the economic engines of the future required burying the evidence of the past. Justice stopped where the balance sheets began. The physical disappearance of the leaders became a functional amnesia. No relics, no inscriptions, no traces. This systematic void turned a logistical execution into a permanent state of official forgetting. 11 unmarked wooden coffins. 1 transport invoice. This single sheet of paper held the silence of a generation. Colonel William S. Sefton managed the void. He was a specialist in psychological operations and counterintelligence. Sefton enforced a strict protocol of compartmentalization. No single officer knew the entire route. No driver knew the final destination. This fragmentation worked for decades. How did the isolation system fail? Through the bureaucratic gears of the United States. In 1974, the strengthening of the Freedom of Information Act forced the Pentagon's hand. The archives began to breathe. The institutional wall cracked in 1975. German historian Ernst Graber obtained a heavily redacted report. It detailed a special transport from Nuremberg to Munich. The date, October 17, 1946. The document mentioned 11 unidentified coffins. It contained a direct reference to the Ostfriedhof crematorium. The orders were absolute: maximum discretion, extreme urgency. 2 years later, the silence broke again. Journalist Joseph B. Persico published a sensation in the New York Times. It was 1977. Persico tracked down a former soldier from the midnight convoy. The veteran described the heat of the ovens and the gray dust. His testimony provided the first reliable confirmation of the fate of the 11 bodies. The veteran's words broke the silence of the ovens, but the state machine remained cold. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the disappearance of the Nuremberg bodies evolved into a systemic void. Physical elimination was not enough. The victors demanded total historical erasure. Washington and London transformed the final moments of the Third Reich into a ghost story. Journalists and independent historians pushed for the truth. They failed. Every request for the logistics of the 1946 convoy hit a wall of classified seals. The United States military archives functioned as a vault. Inside, the documents regarding the 11 coffins lay buried under the label of national security. State bureaucracy became a weapon against memory. Relatives of the executed men filed formal judicial petitions. They received dry administrative rejection stamps. No explanations, no locations. The military apparatus protected a vacuum, citing the risk of neo-Nazi pilgrimages as a universal shield. The Nuremberg trials ended in 1946, but the administrative silence lasted for decades. This policy of total removal extended the hush far beyond the courtroom walls. Global museums face a structural void. Major institutions like Yad Vashem and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum possess millions of artifacts, yet their displays of the Nuremberg executions remain empty. No physical remains, no coffins, not a single authentic post-mortem photograph exists in their archives. The state intentionally erased the material evidence. In 1962, Israel hanged Adolf Eichmann. His body was burned, and his ashes were cast into the sea. But that process was public, photographed, and transparent. Nuremberg was different. No bodies were ever recovered for forensic analysis or genetic testing. Justice was served, but the physical proof vanished. The policy of removal even restricted the smallest details. Authorities enforced a total ban on displaying authentic death masks, personal clothing, or burial urns from the executed leaders. By 1978, the diplomatic wall remained high. The Institute for Contemporary History in Munich formally requested the original logs from the Ostfriedhof crematorium. They wanted to verify dates. They wanted to cross-reference the timing of the secret burnings. The West German diplomatic corps refused the request. They placed the stability of the Cold War above the needs of academic science. It was the final recorded attempt by scholars to access the truth before the archives partially opened in the 1990s. The state denied all academic access for reasons of diplomatic security. The secret of Ostfriedhof remained so systemic that it survived the Cold War and the opening of the archives in the 1990s. For decades, Western intelligence assumed Moscow would weaponize the truth. They were wrong. Declassified Russian documents from the 1990s revealed a startling internal consensus. Soviet officials debated revealing the post-war logistical cover-up. They looked at the maps. They read the transport logs. In the end, the Kremlin reached the same conclusion as the White House. To reveal the truth was to gain nothing. It would only strengthen the enemy. The rational state demanded erasure to prevent a cult. But silence created a myth. In clandestine forums and illegal pamphlets, the executed became martyrs of a new world order. Their physical absence was interpreted as proof of an unspeakable truth. By trying to kill the symbol, the Allies turned the Isar into a ghost. Why does the silence persist today? The 4 permanent members of the UN Security Council, the United States, Great Britain, France, and Russia, maintain a wall of secrecy. There is no joint statement. There is no official report. This operation remains a permanent gray zone of international law. Walk along the Isar today. The water is cold. The current is steady. You will find no plaque, no stone, and no mention of what happened in October 1946. Archivists in Moscow and Washington keep the files locked. The administrative epilogue does not exist. The trail of the Nuremberg executed ends officially and physically in the Isar River.